Part 1, a detailed breakdown of 7th Oct based on true facts.
At Al Jazeera's investigative unit, we've conducted a forensic, meticulous examination of the events of October the 7th. We uncovered very real crimes committed by Hamas and others. But I think what was perhaps most significant were the crimes we discovered that did not happen. And it's hugely concerning that these revelations have been virtually entirely ignored by the Western press. What's extraordinary is the Israelis were aware of the plans. Hamas were actually training quite openly for this operation, and they were actually placing the training videos online so anyone could view them. On the very night of October the 7th, before dawn, spotters along the fence are reporting back to headquarters, and the head of Shin Bet and the head of military intelligence take this seriously enough that in the middle of the night they're up and talking to each other, and they conclude it's just another training exercise. And what is extraordinary is that they don't even raise the alert level to number 1. The most basic alert level would have made a huge difference. And they don't do that, which means that when Hamas bursts through the fence at 6:30 in the morning, they catch many of the defenders in their beds. You can see many of the soldiers are killed in their beds. Hamas had anticipated most of their fighters would be killed trying to get through the fence. In fact, only a small number were killed trying to get through the fence. They were as much taken by surprise as anyone by the performance of Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military. Crucially also, they were taken by surprise by this very large music festival that was taking place, which they don't seem to have been aware of. Having overrun the military bases, the game plan was to grab hostages and take them back. And they do this on a large scale, but they also The Israelis were then extraordinarily slow to respond. Now, they scramble Apache helicopters, but there's no ground control. It's pretty clear that in the chaos, some hostages at least were hit by Apache helicopter fire. We've identified 27 people who were clearly taken hostage, taken captive, and were taken away from their homes, but never made it to the fence, died somewhere between their homes and the fence. There's a fair chance that a number of them were killed by Apache helicopters. Within the kibbutzes, we've identified 18 people who were pretty much certainly killed by the police and the army as they arrived. 12 of them a specific incident in kibbutz Beri, where you have a large number of gunmen, around 40 gunmen, holed up in a house with 13 hostages. A tank is brought in and opens fire on the house. There are 2 survivors from this incident, which is why we know about it. There may be other incidents we don't know about because everyone was killed, but there are 2 survivors from this who spoke to Israeli media. There's a common sense thing. You just have to look at the scale of the destruction, and it's clear that 1,200 men armed with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns did not do all of this. The Hannibal Directive, which was something that was developed in the 1980s by the Israelis, and it was basically to avoid situations where their enemies would capture 1 or 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers and then effectively hold them to ransom. There was one occasion where the Israelis released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in return for a single Israeli soldier. So an order was issued whereby they said, it's better that we kill everyone than allow people to be captured. Now, this was supposedly rescinded several years ago, but at midday on October the 7th, the army revived the Hannibal Directive, put it into effect. 70 vehicles were hit. At least in some of the cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed.
The Israeli military does not deny the report.
The peculiarity of the days after October 7 is that the Israeli media and subsequently the international media choose to focus not on the very real and extensive crimes that Hamas and others did commit, but on crimes they did not commit. And this had 2 focuses. In the days immediately after, it's to do with babies. The most dramatic one is we see an allegation that there were 40 babies killed, many of them beheaded. This is very simple to deal with because we have a comprehensive list of the dead. We know that 2 babies are killed on October the 7th. One is an 10-month-old child who is hit by a bullet fired through a safe room door. The other is a child who dies after an emergency cesarean, a Bedouin child, in fact. Now, any story about babies that does not relate to those 2, and there are a lot of stories about babies, is not true. We know it's not true. This has enormous implications for the other wave of atrocity stories that began very quickly, which is to do with sexual violence, and particularly the Israeli assertion that it was widespread and systematic. To be clear, in the film, we are not saying that there were no rapes on October the 7th. We simply don't know. What we are saying is that there simply is not the evidence. There's not the forensic evidence, there's not the visual evidence, there's not the photographic evidence, and there is not the witness evidence to support the allegation of widespread and systematic rape. The Israelis have this strange system where they farm out the collection of bodies after disasters and terrorist attacks and so on to an organization called Zaka, who are ultra-Orthodox religious volunteers. They collect the bodies, prepare them for religious burial and so on. A character that many people will have seen in the days afterwards is Yossi Landau, who was the southern commander of Zaka, who was on television a great deal. He said,
"The two piles of 10 children each were tied to the back, burned to death."
You then see a phone call which Netanyahu makes to President Biden, where he repeats this story. In fact, he embellishes it.
They took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
Terribly important, this, because it was entirely untrue. We know the house he's talking about. He's talking about the house in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was the house that was stormed by Israeli police and military, and where it is almost certain that all of the hostages were killed by the Israeli police and military. There were 2 children there, 2 twins, but no other children, so we know the story is untrue. Mr. Landau told a number of other stories. There's one particularly notorious one about the fetus being cut out of a pregnant woman.
The baby that was connected to the cord was stabbed, and she was shot in the back.
We simply know this is untrue. The list of the dead show there's no such victim. Mr. Landau said, I have a picture of this atrocity.
If you want to see the picture, I have the picture of it. This is the baby.
I'm sorry to be graphic here, but I can't see a baby here.
You can't see the baby but this is the picture of the mother.
It was a piece of charred flesh. It wasn't a baby. It certainly wasn't a baby. So it was interesting. And psychologically, I'm not quite sure why he offered to show me a photo that he didn't have. I'd point out as well that Zaka was an organization that was in trouble. There had been a major scandal. Its founder had been accused of child sexual abuse. There was a financial scandal. It had been found to be cooking the books. It's raised an awful lot of money since October the 7th. These stories were clearly useful, and they were useful to the Israeli government. In the film, we see Benjamin Netanyahu visiting Zaka volunteers and thanking them for talking to the world's media and stressing that this is another front in the war.
מנהיגים וגם לדעת הקהל. ויש לכם חלק חשוב בהשפעה על דעת הקהל שמשפיע גם על מנהיגים.
Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether this type of atrocity was committed, but not that type? People were killed in this way, not that way. It matters because the murder of babies and widespread rape has a particular resonance. It's particularly triggering. The Israeli government and its supporters, when they justify the brutality of the subsequent bombardment and invasion of the Gaza Strip, again and again and again, what they always reference is babies and rape.
Young girls who were raped and then murdered.
Women brutally raped and murdered.
Little kids who are beheaded.
Pictures of terrorists beheading children.
These bastards put these babies in an oven and put on their oven. We found the kid a few hours later.
This is something you see in previous conflicts as well. If you want to dehumanize an enemy, if you want to desensitize people to the suffering that is inflicted on that enemy, then you portray them as barbarians, basically as savages, as people who are not deserving of humane treatment. And that's why it's relevant. That's why it's important to pick apart. A lot of the world's leading media outlets have done in-depth investigations where they have concluded there was widespread, systematic, instrumentalized, weaponized rape. The New York Times makes a particular feature of the story of a young woman. She was killed early in the morning, 9 miles north of the music festival site, as she and her husband were fleeing. The New York Times, in its big December investigation into sexual violence, leads with this, and about a third of the article consists of her story. And it's immediately undermined because the woman's sister then posts on Instagram immediately afterwards, this isn't true, we know she wasn't raped. She was texting us until minutes before her death. It's also the case that her husband had a lengthy phone conversation immediately after her death with his brother, and again made no mention of rape. So it's very important that